So this is for Megan and Josh. As a historian of Soviet Ukraine and looking at a lot of ethnicity and language politics, I'm so uncomfortable with your paper, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who is, with this correlation between language choice and ethnicity and politics. You know, even in your charts, what do you mean by Ukrainian? What do you mean by Russian? Do you mean language? Do you mean self-identification? Do you mean a political choice coming out of the aforesaid senses of identity? And to me, the situation, again, not from big data, right, from just more qualitative archival research, seems to be much more fluid and complex. And even, of course, when people make tweets, they're making a choice, but are they really making a choice, or is it just, I got a tweet and I'm more comfortable in this language? So to have a question, I'm wondering if you've thought about any kind of comparative dimension or any other cases of places that are multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, largely bilingual, right, to add some sort of comparative dimension to this case. But thank you so much.
So I think I have to talk and then it comes on maybe. Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, that's a really great suggestion, and I think that that's something that's worth thinking about. I think that I appreciate and recognize the complexity of the situation, and obviously I hope that you can see in the paper that we're trying to sort of wrestle with the fact that we understand that it's more complex than this and are trying to sort of find a way to kind of get at these issues in a new way and from a new direction in the ways that we have available. I think that what I hope that moving forward, one of the reasons I'd love to go back and try to pull text from people's Twitter accounts from before the crisis is to try to see if we can maybe isolate a group of people who are sort of clearly calling on sort of themes of identity before the crises even happen, right? And then to see how those people compare to people who don't talk about those things until the crises happen, or something like this, to try to get at some of those, so yeah, some of the content and also some of the nuance that you're suggesting. And I think another thing that is really complicated with the way that we've done the location analysis, but that I think would be really valuable, would be to try to find at least some subset that we can look at to compare also sort of some regional differences and what does it look like when we're talking about people from Donbass and when we're talking about people from Kiev and when we're talking about other types of people. That's complicated and imprecise with the way that we have those kinds of information, but I think that those are important things to move forward with. And I like the idea of a comparative case. To be honest, I hadn't considered that, and I think it's an interesting way to maybe think about moving forward.
So don't be uncomfortable, because I can tell you the answers to your questions. All we're measuring is the language that people chose to interact with in Twitter and the language that they chose to tweet in. That's it. We're not making any assumptions about anyone's identity, about anything. All we said was there's a theory out there that says in times of crisis, people should revert back to their dominant identity, that the identity should be activated, and that maybe in the course of your life you bump around between, sometimes you use Russian, sometimes you use Ukrainian, but in this moment of crisis, would your identity be activated? And we thought this is a neat new way to see if this happens. And it didn't happen. I mean, it happened a little bit, but what did happen was this very dramatic shift that we found in the middle of the crisis, and we are being incredibly explicit about what that is. That of the people who said they wanted to interact with Twitter in Russian, the proportion who were tweeting in Russian went up dramatically after Russia got involved. And the proportion tweeting in Ukrainian who chose to interact with in Ukrainian went down. That's it. So there's nothing to be uncomfortable about. We're very explicit about what we're laying out there. You can say, I think this was a terrible test of ethnic activation. I would never have run this in the first place, but we still have the very interesting finding that begs to be described. We thought it was a novel way to use new data, be able to look at a lot of people at these language choices. I mean, quite frankly, we're also, what we really want to, what Megan keeps saying, the individual level, one of the things we can do with this data, it's a lot more intensive, is we can look at individuals and see at the individual level how many were switching languages before, and then did they stop switching languages afterwards. But we are left with this very interesting aggregate puzzle. But we're not sneaking anything into it. We're not claiming anything more than it is. We said, this is a theory that's out here. This seems like one possible interesting observable application of it. The data didn't particularly support it at all. And you can disagree with us of whether or not you thought it was a useful observable implication. We thought it was something worth testing.
Jennifer. You presented a fantastic paper, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you very much. One of the things that I find really amazing about Maidan was the bottom-up creativity of creation of memes. So things like, for example, Bimba and Yanukovych Pidaresht and Nestle Maidan. In other words, these slogans that have multiple meanings. And basically, it's creation of icons from the bottom up. And my impression was that in the mimicry, or in the bait and shift, as you're calling it, that was being done by someone. In other words, it was a top-down process as opposed to the actual creation, original creation, which was a bottom-up process. Do you have evidence of that top-down, sort of who was doing the bait and shift? And was this something that was, I mean, is there a source? Is there, I don't mean to push you into conspiracy theory, but I'm kind of pushing you into conspiracy theory.
Certainly. Yeah, it's true, the creation of memes and things. I wish I could just show you guys pictures forever, because I have a hard drive with like 20 gigs of photographs of just buttons and stickers, and they're fascinating. Look for the book. But in terms of, yeah, I agree with you that it's a top-down, and it felt top-down, and there was evidence of it being top-down when I was there. The same thing, it's also fair to, I think, refer to a top-down on a very small scale at Maidan as well, because like some of the stickering campaigns, for example, they were extremely well branded, and Ukraine is just filled with wildly talented graphics artists, right? So it's not a huge surprise that these are very well put together things, but there were definitely coordinated efforts, right? So it was not truly, you know, the grassworks efforts of like Marxist fantasies. It was like there was coordination and organization and structure. But as far as who is taking charge of these mimicry campaigns, right? The ones that are not satire at their face and not intended to use humor in politics, they're intended to deceive and frighten and charge people to action. As to who's doing it, I mean, unless it's literally branded Russia Today, it's really hard to know. There's a lot of theories that are out there, especially with people I knew that were from Kiev and had been embedded in that socio-political environment for a very, very long time, had a lot of ideas about what particular, regional police leader was making decisions, or like who exactly was in the car passing out bats to Titushki on the corner, things of that nature. But it's really, really hard to track exactly where they come from, and that's, I think, what makes them so particularly insidious. I will say, though, that of all of the conspiracy theories that I've heard around Maidan, very few of them ended up being wrong. So while it's certainly not like you can't validate this sort of data, it's definitely worth talking to people who are local, who are native to the culture, native to the Kiev social structure, and getting a sense from them about where it came from.
I wanted to add that I hear the answers you gave, but I still wonder whether, in a way, your research is still kind of, in a way, it's kind of built on a presumption that the languages you will say something about your political choices. And I also just wonder, in the sense of using this ethnic politics literature, how useful it is, because I worked a lot on the Balkans before, so I'm also quite familiar with a lot of these issues. But I just found, I mean, is it possible that one would be in danger of kind of ethnicizing a kind of identity question that maybe not that shouldn't be ethnicized, and it in a way also playing into a certain narrative of that has come up in the conflict in Ukraine that I've seen. And at least, I mean, from living in Kiev at the moment, and I'm no expert on kind of the past, but I found that the use of language and how that reflects how people identify themselves ethnically really is very, very complex and very kind of faceted. I mean, I met people like in Donetsk we interviewed this guy from Svoboda who insisted on speaking in Ukrainian, but actually could not speak in Ukrainian, and our interpreter kind of gave up eventually. He said, "Can you just please speak in Russian?" And I've also met people in Kiev who say that they're, that ethnically they're Russian, they're even born in Russia, but they live in Ukraine and identify themselves as Ukrainians. I just wonder, in that terms, whether this language issue is really a marker that is, in that sense, useful.
Thank you.
So to both of you, I just want to be, everyone who's uncomfortable about this hypothesis, I want to be very clear. We didn't find any evidence to support it. You should all be comfortable, right? But this is actually a really serious issue. We have a huge positive publication bias in academia. where we only want to publish things that confirm the theory that we start with. And journals only publish things this is a big issue in social science we're debating enormously. Is this hypothesis that people would revert to using a dominant language in types of political crisis a credible hypothesis based on the constructivist ethnic politics literature? Yeah, it's a credible hypothesis. It is a credible hypothesis. It falls out of a long-standing existing literature that plays a huge role in how we think about ethnic politics. Is there evidence to support that in this paper? No. Right? So the question is, why is there no evidence to support this in this paper? Why do we not find it? But everyone who's uncomfortable about this, who thinks language should be strategic, what we said was, we don't find evidence of this ethnic identification thing, and we want to suggest a whole bunch of reasons why we think the data looks like there could be a viable strategic theory of language usage, or a convenience theory of language usage, or a language theory of usage that's dictated by international context that has nothing to do with ethnic identification. So everyone should feel comfortable. The finding goes along with your predisposition, but it does it cuts across a dominant literature and political science. But it may be because it was a bad operationalization. We're not going out on a limb and saying it's because the constructivist theory of political science is wrong. And it may be for some of the reasons that you were saying that it's a bad activation because people are using language for other reasons. But we're not claiming, you shouldn't walk out of here being like, oh yeah, those are the guys who said that they used Twitter to show that people activated their identity by tweeting in particular ways.
I just have a question about geographically where these tweets come from within Ukraine, because I mean, it seems like an obvious explanation for the pattern you find is that most of the action before February 20th is in western and central Ukraine where they speak Ukrainian, but after February 20th, the action moves to eastern Ukraine where more people speak Russian. So in other words, that would suggest that, so I mean, I assume you've looked at this, but.
So actually we've looked to make sure that they're all over the country. We did this check of the geocoded tweets, and we did find that they're all over the country. We haven't done it by date. We can look at it by date. But just to be very clear, the data that we've shown you right now, it's all about proportions, not about total numbers. I mean, we showed you a couple total number slides, but for the most part, these patterns came in the proportions of tweets, right? So it would, if your explanation is correct, it would have to be that the same original choices were being made about language usage, but different choices were being made regionally. I mean, it's not impossible that it would be the case.
I'm sorry, you could imagine that, for example, someone who's originally chose Ukrainian but more of those who live in eastern Ukraine would revert to Russian, and because you have a disproportionate number of Russian people from eastern Ukraine post February 20th, that might explain.
Yeah, we'll take a look. I'd be more worried if I was showing you absolute values of things, but since it's a proportion of people who made this, you would just expect the people in eastern Ukraine to mainly have chosen Russian in the first place. Right, like that's why I don't think it explains this sharp divergence among the Ukrainians.
And anyways, but it's easy to check.